You can't judge a book by its cover, so to speak.
Y'all ever worry about getting contaminated? Because you are, at least you're within proximity of potentially hazardous fluids.
We wear all of the protective equipment that we can possibly put on ourselves. We have a full body suit. We double layer and tape our gloves. We have footies. We have masks, face shields to protect from splatter. The list goes on. If we find a new product that's going to keep us safe from all this, then it's generally on our order list.
Right, and OSHA mandates that any sort of company in our field, you're conducting like an annual safety analysis. Like Ryan said, you're going to look for new products, and you're vaccinated. We have to provide Hep B vaccinations for all of our employees. So we protect ourselves as best we can in what we do.
So don't you cringe, though, when you hear about people doing it themselves who don't have the proper training?
Oh, yeah.
That they don't realize what they're in for and what the potential for danger is?
Definitely, because one of the most common chances for exposure is, if you have someone who passes away on, say, a floor and it was up against a wall or something like that, where the carpet meets the wall is the tack strip. Now, when the blood penetrates through the carpet and through the padding to that tack strip, when you pull that carpet up, essentially what you have is a strip of just saturated spikes, just waiting to get somebody. So that's a huge hazard, and that's just one just one little thing. Yeah, it really unsettles me. But that's we're talking about physical risks right now. Take into account the psychological risks, such as, you hear about post-traumatic stress disorder, us being veterans and stuff like that. We've kind of encountered people, suffering from the after effects of that. That's actually a documented risk of being a participant of our industry. So that especially applies to families wherein, it's their own relative that they might be, cleaning up their house, from. So...
Is it important for you to know the circumstances of the person's death, not just how they died, but perhaps where they were, what position they were in, things like that, so that you can kind of anticipate where you might have to look?
I would say no. Simply, it's important. For example, if we can find that out, we'd like to know, because blood pattern analysis, for example, if you can find out that yes, it was a gunshot, and you can look at the pattern of the, say, I'm being graphic here, but the splatter on the wall, you can kind of figure out where it's gone and really perform the best cleanup and get it all out of the room. But on that same note, we're taking into account sensitivity, and so we're not going to ask a family, hey, what happened or anything like that. If they volunteer that, then
We also have a special indicator solution which will help us pick up anything that we can't see.
Are y'all ever asked to testify in court? You're young, maybe you haven't had the experience yet, but I would imagine that perhaps if you haven't yet, it's coming.
Not yet, but one thing that we do to make sure we hopefully never get into that situation is we call the law enforcement to make sure that the crime scene has been released before cleaning up, because we don't want to be cleaning up after any mob-related incident or anything like that.
And also, in some of these crime scenes today, I remember the O.J. Simpson case, where the detectives walked all over the place and, they stepped their feet on contaminated a lot of this blood evidence and things like that. It's very, very, you can get DNA evidence from very flimsy stuff today, but you can also contaminate it very easily.
Right. What we kind of do to approach that is if we're seeing any kind of bullet casings or weapons or anything that we could identify as suspected evidence, even though we're there after the authorities, we're going to place another call to confirm, hey, did y'all just not need this, or was this really something that that was needed? And so we leave it alone at that point before it's even touched. But we try to work closely with law enforcement to confirm those types of things.
It is important that law enforcement know who we are, because we are the last people that see the evidence.
We're talking with Ben Lichtenwellner and Ryan Sawyer from Biotrauma, a company that specializes in trauma and death scene contamination. How far will you go, by the way, geographically? You're located here in Metro Atlanta, specifically Gainesville, but how far would you travel to help somebody?
We'll go anywhere in the Southeast.
So that means the Carolinas, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Tennessee, things like that.
Right.
Right, and typically we're responding Metro Atlanta. Even up north, like Gainesville area, we see a lot of incident cleanups that we do. But yeah, we're available for the whole Southeast. And one other thing of note, talking about service availability, is we're a 24-hour service. So we learned that, in the Marine Corps, because what we would do is, we'd get calls 3 in the morning from planes flying in at night to avoid being shot down by, rocket fire or anything like that, to receive remains to transport back to the U.S. So we carry that mentality over from the Marines back to the States.
And I want to ask you about your Marine Corps experience a little bit more in just a minute, guys, but I would imagine in some of the smaller towns in the Southeast, they don't have people readily available to them who do what you do. So they've got to go to the big city to get somebody who has that kind of resource.
There's several companies in the Southeast. The thing of note is to figure out whether or not are they compliant with not only federal regulations, which most are aware of, but the state of Georgia actually requires a letter from the state saying that you are authorized to use whatever disinfectant that you're using for this application. So yeah, a lot of outlying cities, they do have to look around to find somebody, but we try to do our part and get the word out to them, and hopefully they'll look for who's compliant.
Let me ask you a situation. Let's say it's a suicide. I mean, these things do happen. And you have a case study in your literature here, Pinnacle Homes at Rocky Ridge, and it looks like, it looks like maybe a condo complex, that kind of thing, where the homes, back in my day, we used to call these row homes, now they call them townhomes, but it's the same thing. So something happens in one home, but it could affect the adjoining home. It could affect the home above it. I would imagine that the neighbors are all concerned about contamination. There's also a psychological effect on the neighbors. Now there's been a suicide in the air, or a murder, or a death of any sort. How do you handle a situation like that where you're affecting people in the immediate area?
Well, to get away from some of the taboo in our industry, we show up in unmarked vehicles. That way, you're always going to get those nosy neighbors that are wondering what happened. But as far as the property goes, that's why we try to market heavily to property management groups, and just because they need to know quickly who to call in a situation like this before it ends up affecting neighboring units.
Right, and you could have a multi-floor incident, or obviously with an unintended death. I mean, the odor problem can be terrible for all these, adjacent units. And like we said earlier, with the gravity and whatnot, the dispersal of body fluids through one big unit can affect a lot of people.
Sometimes the death itself is caused